All right. Thank you all so much for spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it. I do want to ask that if you are not currently asking a question or needing to ask a question, if you will go ahead and turn off your screen. We are going to be recording this, so we do want to make sure that Austina is the one who's going to be focused on in the recording as well. So if you don't mind going ahead and turning off screens, then we'll make sure that we can hide those participant views and make sure that everyone is, we can just focus really on Austina, who's here with us today. We're really excited that she is here to join us. So we'll get started in just one more minute. I know I want to value all of your time, but we've got a few more people still coming into the waiting room. So we just want to give them the opportunity to do that. So just one moment and then we'll get started. All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. Really appreciate you coming and spending your next couple of hours with us. We're going to get started in just one more minute. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tiffany Price. I'm the head of school at Nova Middle School in Olympia, Washington, and we are just delighted to have Austina De Bonte here with us today. Austina comes with a huge depth of knowledge regarding gifted and twice exceptional students. She is the founder, I believe, of Smart is Not Easy, and also has been the president of the Washington Coalition for Gifted Education and past president of the Northwest Gifted Child Association, as well as lots of other things. I know I have had the opportunity to hear Austina speak multiple times, and she is a real expert in everything there is to know about gifted kids and what the challenges and struggles and joys of having these quirky kids. So without further ado, thanks so much for being here, Austina, and thank you to all of our participants. We are going to ask that you use the chat feature so that you can get your questions answered, and towards the end of the presentation, we'll culminate all of those questions and give you an opportunity to hear from Austina for those specific questions as well. So thank you so much for being here, and with that, I will turn it over to Austina. Thanks so much for being here.
Fabulous. Thanks, Tiffany. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity, and I'm glad to see so many people here. So hello, my name is Austina De Bonte. I think Tiffany kind of gave my bio. One thing that she didn't mention is that I'm working on my doctoral degree at Bridges Graduate School, and if there's anybody interested in getting a graduate degree in gifted and twice exceptional education, that is a great place to do that. It's a wonderful online program. Everything that we are talking about today is fully available online. You can see a link to the slides at the bottom. Feel free to take note of that. I'll also put it up at the very end. And so let's jump in. Here is what we're going to talk about today. As Tiffany mentioned, please put your questions in the chat as they occur to you. Chances are you're not going to remember them all at the end, so I really encourage you to write them down as they occur to you, because we're going to cover a lot of ground and we're going to go at a pretty good clip. So here's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to start with some definitions and talk about what we mean by asynchrony in this population. We're going to talk about twice exceptional students. We're going to talk about executive function and neuroscience. We're going to talk about emotional characteristics in this population, social development, grit, growth mindset, and underachievement, and how it all comes together at school. I have a few closing words on equity and give you a few jobs to do after the presentation. But before we jump in too much, I would like to get a better sense as to who's here. So I'm going to put up some polls. The first poll is going to ask you what age range of kids are either in your house or in your classroom if you're a teacher. And so that'll give me a better idea as to who's here tonight and to help me tailor what we're going to talk about. Give you 5 more seconds to get an answer in. All right, and I'll let you take a look so that you can see that it seems like our sweet spot here is end of elementary to middle school, which is what I would expect, given that we're being hosted by Nova Middle School today. Nova Middle School is pretty fabulous middle school in Olympia, Washington, that focuses just on middle school students and specifically on gifted students. So it's a pretty unique and amazing place. So if you happen to be in the Olympia area, definitely check it out. I'm going to put up the second poll, which will ask you what your role is. Oh, why is it not letting me do that? Oh, because I need to stop sharing the other one. There we go. Okay, so there you go. Are you a parent, a teacher, or perhaps a principal or administrator? We have a number of teachers here today because Nova is also offering some clock hours as part of this presentation, which is just a great service that they're providing to the community. And so it's great to see a number of you here. And I'll give you just a couple more seconds to answer. And it looks like all the responses are in, and I'll let you take a gander at that. All right, well, fabulous. So looks like we are heavy on parents, but also have quite a few teachers here tonight. And so I will keep that in mind as we go. All right, so let's jump into it. We have to start here. We have to talk about this word gifted. You know, some people would call it the G word. It's a tricky word. It's not very well understood. People will say things that are not exactly true. They'll say, you know, every child is gifted. And while every child certainly has gifts, not every child is gifted in the technical meaning of the word, or at least not in the academic meaning of the word. There are some negative connotations to this word, and there's definitely this sort of elitist vibe that hovers underneath the word gifted, which is really unfortunate. But it is a technical term. It's the term that's used by researchers and professional organizations. And because I'm going to be sharing a lot of research tonight, it's really important that I use that term. I can't really change the research. However, I want you to know that it's really okay to imagine synonyms in your head. There are some really fabulous synonyms for gifted: smart, very bright, high intelligence, high IQ. In Washington State, we say highly capable, or HICAP for short. That's actually a unique Washingtonism. No other state does that. That's really just us. But one thing that is not a great synonym for gifted is high achieving. Some of these kids, in fact, many of these kids are high achieving, but not all. And that does not mean that they don't have needs, and that does not mean that they don't deserve services. And so we'll talk about the various reasons why a kid might not be high achieving, but still be gifted as we go through tonight. So let's take just a quick stop to think about some definitions, the Washington State laws, and this idea of asynchrony. So first, the law. Here's what Washington State law says about HICAP. Law was actually passed way back in 2011, went into effect in 2014. Requires all public schools in the state to serve highly capable students in grades K-12. And really that statement in white in the middle of the screen is the most essential. The legislature finds that for highly capable students, access to accelerated learning and enhanced instruction is access to a basic education. Basic education actually means a lot in Washington State. It means that it's part of the core of education. It's not an extra or an add-on. But I really want to focus on these 5 words: accelerated learning and enhanced instruction. So accelerated learning, when we think about those words, accelerated means it has to go faster or it has to perhaps go further or higher. Learning, it means that a kid actually has to be learning something new. They need to not have already known it. And then enhanced instruction, not just the same instruction, but actual enhanced instruction. And actual instruction, not just the kid teaching themselves something new in the corner or handing them a higher level textbook or having them do an independent project. In Washington State, we expect all school districts to provide both accelerated learning and enhanced instruction. That little word "and" in the middle is actually pretty powerful. Districts are required to do both, not just one or the other. It's actually a pretty tall order. I would say not all, and certainly not even many school districts in our state are really achieving that, but that is in fact what is required of them by law. There have also been some changes in law. Back in 2016, there was a change in federal law when No Child Left Behind got re-upped as ESSA that actually included provisions in federal law for gifted education. It's actually the first time that gifted education has shown up in sort of mainstream federal education law. It's kind of a big deal. In 2017 here in Washington, school districts got a double amount of funding. They also added a bunch of provisions for low-income students. In 2018, they added more equitable identification practices, and I am delighted to share with you that we now know that in 2023, it is about to be signed into law that universal screening is going to be required in all Washington State school districts starting next school year. Both in early and late elementary school. So in or before 2nd grade, and again, in or before 6th grade. So that's really a big deal, especially when you think about making sure that all students really get identified, a theme that we're going to come back to at the very end of the talk. All right, so let's kind of get clear on what we're really talking about. One of the definitions, one of the original definitions of giftedness hinges on IQ. IQ is a normally distributed thing. It shows up in a bell curve. And those two standard deviations in the middle, right around 100, which is really just an arbitrary number. It was decided, many generations ago. We call those kids who have that sort of typical development neurotypical. They follow the ages and stages of the baby book. They develop the way that schools and teachers and parents and pediatricians expect that they would. As you go standard deviations to the right, you've got mildly gifted, moderately gifted, highly gifted, and even profoundly gifted. I'll point out that there's actually a wider range in the gifted range than there is in the neurotypical range in terms of difference of IQ levels. You'll also notice that this diagram is symmetrical, right? We've got all those same standard deviations on the other side also. Let me give you an example. So if we had a kid who was a 10-year-old and they were spot on neurotypical, they had an IQ of exactly 100, we would say that kid has a mental age of 10. IQ, actually, the very first definition of IQ was a ratio between mental age and chronological age. That is, what questions could they get right compared to others of a different age. Now, if we took that 10-year-old and gave them an IQ of 140, we would say that kid had a mental age of 14. They're answering the same questions as a typical neurotypical 14-year-old. And of course, we have that same difference on the other side. I put this out not because IQ is the be all and end all. It's a really useful construct. It tells us a lot of things. It does not tell us everything that we want to know. And in fact, if you ever got your kid IQ tested, you won't just get one number. You'll actually get a whole bevy of numbers. And it's actually the patterns between them that tell you the most, not just the composite score. But regardless, one of the reasons I put this up, and I think it's an important sort of foundation, is to recognize that our kids are perhaps a little different than we expect. It's not a 1 or 2 year difference. It could be a 3 or 4 or more year difference. compared to sort of their neurotypical age mates. They don't look that different on the outside, or occasionally they do. But they really are that different in terms of how they think and how they process. And that really deserves our attention. But a more modern way of understanding these kids is that they are asynchronous. They have kind of this up and down profile of development. They don't do everything at the same time. It's really typical, here's an example of a 5-year-old. For a kid to be working way ahead in math, let's say this kid is working at like they were an 8-year-old in math, even further ahead in reading, but maybe not quite so far ahead in writing. Why would reading and writing be so different? Well, if we're talking about a 5-year-old, right, fine motor matters a lot, right? But actually, a difference between reading and writing, or trouble with writing, which is sometimes called dysgraphia, is actually quite common in our population. And so this kid may or may not outgrow that asynchrony between reading and writing. It's not uncommon for these kids to be lagging a little bit in their emotional development and their emotional regulation skills. It's actually quite common, however, even at the same time, for them to have an advanced conception of social relationships. That is, their concept of what it means to be a friend is more sophisticated. But their social skills, their practical and pragmatic social skills, may only be age appropriate. That little asynchrony within themselves on social development has some pretty interesting implications that we're going to get into in another 45 minutes or so. The bottom line here is that most of our kids develop in this asynchronous up and down profile. They don't always do things in lockstep. And so that can be quite confusing for the kid. It can be quite confusing for parents and for teachers. And we need to be real careful that we don't make assumptions, that we don't say things like, well, this kid can do such sophisticated math, like why aren't they more mature? Or why can't they spell? Or why can't they remember their math facts, or whatever? It's very unlikely for a kid to be high in everything. Much more realistic and typical for kids to have this sort of up and down profile. It's also quite likely for these kids to show up in every population demographic. We don't expect there to be demographic skew. We expect to find just as many girls versus boys. We expect to find these kids in every socioeconomic group, in every language speaking group. No matter how you slice the demographics, we expect to find these kids everywhere. That is not necessarily true in public gifted programs, and that's why we've been working so hard on equitable identification strategies like universal screening to make sure that these kids really are found in all of those demographic groups. We'll come back around to that at the end of the talk. IQ also runs in families. Whether it's nature or nurture, it doesn't matter. Families have both. When you have siblings of the same parents who are living in the same household, it's quite likely for them to have IQs that are within about a standard deviation of each other. And so some of you might be here thinking that you were kind of had a particular kiddo in mind when you came to this talk. I want to encourage you to think about all the kids in your house. That chances are what we're talking about today is not just one kid, it's probably everybody in your household, and perhaps even your extended family as well. One of the reasons why a kid might not on the surface appear to be highly capable is that they might actually be what we would call twice exceptional. This is a really nice analogy, metaphor for twice exceptional, this photo here. These twice exceptional kids, they can do amazing things. The vista is fantastic, but the road is really curvy. And sometimes it looks like it might be going backwards at times, and it's not even clear which way you ought to be going. I think that's a great sort of feeling behind the reality of living with a twice exceptional human. What do I mean by this? Twice exceptional means that you've got a kid who is both gifted as well as has some sort of disability, learning difference, or other challenge that might be getting in the way. It really can be anything. And I'm going to highlight just a few that I think are the ones you're least likely to run into in other spaces here in just a minute. But the big picture is that these kids hide. We often don't notice them. There is a much higher incidence than is actually noticed, particularly in schools, and schools do a fairly miserable job, public schools anyway, at identifying these kids. It's genuinely tricky to identify them because they have such amazing horsepower in their brain. They can often compensate or mask various parts of their disabilities, especially when the schoolwork they're being asked to do is not actually that difficult for them. So when they're under challenged in school, they can get by a lot longer. And so we don't necessarily realize either their giftedness or their disability. Diagnosis is super tricky, really important to find an expert. If this is an area of interest or concern, this is a big part of my private consulting business. One way to think about twice exceptional kids is that they are neurodiverse, that they have a different brain. There's a way in which all gifted kids are neurodiverse. Just the notion of giftedness is a different sort of brain that has some pluses and also has some challenges, and that's going to become clear over the next hour or so. But when you have a kid who's got a disability on top of that, that makes them extra neurodiverse. Neurodiversity is a word that started in the autism movement, but really these days reflects all kinds of differences in terms of how brains work and how they operate and kind of what their default mode is. And so one way to really, that can be very helpful for kids is to understand themselves, not as a kid with a disability necessarily, but as a kid who is neurodiverse, who does things differently, sees things differently. That comes with some beautiful pluses, and it also comes with some challenges. But it's much less about being better or worse and much more just about being different. I'm going to talk about 3 different disabilities that I don't think get identified as frequently as they ought to. And so these are the ones that you're least likely to run into other places. The first one I want to talk about is dyslexia. It can really be subtle in the gifted population, so subtle that it sometimes gets called stealth dyslexia, or in the research literature, sometimes called compensated dyslexia. In our population, kids who are dyslexic often do not have any trouble, any visible trouble with reading. They actually read just fine for especially elementary work, and even into middle school. How are they doing it? They're actually memorizing words. They're reading everything as whole words. Because you see, dyslexia is not actually about reading per se. The root cause behind dyslexia is something called phonological awareness, which is about the brain understanding the sounds of language and how the sounds of language come together. Well, if a kid is having trouble sounding out words and skip straight to memorizing words, they can be a very proficient and very early reader, and many of our kids are. But if you remember that your kid never really stopped to sound out words, that actually might be a concern. And it might be an even bigger concern if you're noticing now that that kid is really having a lot of trouble with spelling. Because really the opposite of sounding out words, which is a sort of a quintessential problem for a person who has trouble with phonological awareness, is doing it the other way, which is spelling, And so when you've got a kid who can't spell very well, and who also, when they see an unfamiliar word, they're likely to guess. They have a hard time sounding out or decoding unfamiliar words. That starts happening at higher rates in middle school, high school, and beyond, when you start seeing, interesting Latin words and strange explorer names and that kind of stuff in school. And so that's when the reading problems tend to show up a little bit more. For any type of dyslexia, early intervention is super important. Dyslexia intervention in 1st or 2nd grade is twice as effective as intervention in 3rd grade, even for our high IQ kiddos. If you have any thought whatsoever with, especially with your young elementary school kids, that this might be going on in your house, please look into it. Many of these kids do not get diagnosed until middle or high school, where they really start running into giant problems. And while intervention is still effective at that point, it is more laborious and the outcomes are not quite as good. If you're curious about looking into this with your kid, there is a free screener available for phonological awareness. It's available at thepasttest.com. All right. Next one I want to talk about is vision processing disorders. This is not about whether the kid needs glasses. This is actually about how well the two eyes are working well together. It's really not about the eyeballs, and it's not about the muscles in the eye. It's really all about the brain and how well the brain is controlling the eyes and how well the brain is fusing the input that it's getting from the two eyes into one solid image. There are a bunch of different flavors of vision processing disorders. One of the ones that's easiest to think about is about how eyes move across the page when a kid is reading. So the eyes really should be moving together, but if they're not moving together and one eye is bobbling behind, that's when things actually go in and out of focus. If it's significant, that's actually when things can flip or words or letters can move on the page. If your kid is talking about anything like that, we might have in past decades thought of that as dyslexia. That's not likely dyslexia. That's much more likely to be a vision issue than dyslexia. There are also other things that can happen where the two eyes are not working well together. Often these kids are a little bit clumsy, or they resist reading or doing a lot of near work and they kind of have stamina issues. With a young kid, you might notice a kid who dislikes reading when the fonts get smaller. Does great with picture books, doesn't really want to move to more sort of chapter book style books. It's quite common in all kids, not just in high IQ kids. Sometimes the first sign that you see is actually a kid who does not qualify for their school district's highly capable program, because actually the vision task of taking those tests is a lot more significant than people realize. It is only diagnosed by a specialist called a developmental optometrist. There are some great ones in our area. If you're in the Seattle metro area, my favorite is Alderwood Vision Therapy up in Linwood, but there are plenty of others. COVD.org, which existed long before COVID, has listings of practitioners across the country. Highly suggest that you look for somebody with the FCOVD fellowship credential. Vision therapy really does work if it is done consistently and by a practitioner who really knows what they're doing. Of all the things that could be going on, vision is one of the things that you can actually just make it go away if you do enough therapy. It's important to recognize that vision processing disorders are not dyslexia. Dyslexia is about phonological awareness. Vision is about vision. However, it is not uncommon for a kid who has trouble with reading or has trouble with spelling or who has trouble with writing to actually have both issues, and they each need their own support and their own intervention. Last one I'm going to talk about tonight is auditory processing disorders. Again, this is about the left-right integration between these input systems, now not the vision system, but the auditory system. And it's about how the brain is processing what the ears hear. Often what's happening is it's a timing issue between the two ears. So sound is coming in both ears at the same time. The brain is processing it a little longer on one side of the brain than on the other. By the time the sound signal meets in the middle of the brain and the brain's trying to make sense of it, way down at the brainstem level, deep in the brain, it's often timed by just a little bit. In a quiet environment where there's no background noise, the brain can usually put it together. But if there is a lot of noise, there's multiple signals going into both ears. Because of that timing issue, the brain doesn't always hear it as words. They may hear it as noise. And so that timing difference can cause a lot of anxiety, can cause a kid to dislike noisy environments, to dislike sudden noises, to have trouble with auditory memory in general, to have trouble distinguishing foreground and background conversation. In general, when you've got a kid who's really having trouble tolerating a classroom situation, maybe who's having a lot of outbursts or behavior issues, or is just really unhappy in the classroom, it's almost always, in my experience, an auditory issue. It's only diagnosed by a specialist. And for this one, probably the most useful intervention that I can recommend is getting an ear filter. Unfortunately, you have to go to Colorado to get it, but it is a fairly magical device. It is a tiny, skinny little piece of plastic. It goes just in one ear, and it solves the root problem behind auditory processing disorders, which is the timing issue. Since it's only in one ear, it's actually evening up the timing. And that's all it's doing. It's a quite low-tech solution that solves it at the root cause, which I'm a big fan of. So perhaps something there triggered something for you, in which case I encourage you to look into it a bit more. But even if this isn't your personal story, you're probably noticing that, like, man, this is complex. And you're right, it is. It's so complex that there's actually a national organization that has been running what they call a misdiagnosis initiative for many, many years now. There are lots of different flavors of misdiagnosis, where kids don't get diagnosed at all, where they get the wrong diagnosis, or probably the most common and the one that hurts my heart the most is twice exceptional kids who are not recognized as being gifted or for their disability or challenge, and they don't get the support on either side that they need. If you're looking for more information on this, there's a great book, there's a website, or certainly you can reach out to me personally. All right, so let's jump in and talk about executive function. This is where we're also going to jump in and talk a little bit about neuroscience, which is a personal favorite topic of mine. All right, so what is executive function all about? I love to start talking about executive function with a quote by Sandy Wollum. Sandy Wollum is a head of school down at Seabury School in Tacoma. That is a gifted specialty school that goes kindergarten or pre-K to 8th grade. She gives a talk by this title, "If I'm so smart, why can't I find my keys?" Perhaps you have a kid who can't keep track of their keys, or maybe their homework or their pencil or their lunchbox, or they're piling up jackets on the playground. It's one of these sort of very confusing things about this population, because we kind of assume that they all have their act together, that, you know, these really smart kids should really be able to do this stuff. And yet executive function is an area where our kids tend to have a surprising amount of trouble. Executive function stuff falls into organizational things as well as regulatory things, and we'll come back to this list in a little bit. But first, I want to show you some neuroscience that's going to make this make a little bit more sense. All right, so there's fairly fresh neuroscience that's telling us that every brain is really quite unique, just like a fingerprint. And we're not even just talking about gifted brains or neurodiverse brains or twice exceptional brains. Really, just like every brain is unique, like a fingerprint. Now, when you've got a neurodiverse brain, it's going to be that much more different than typical. So how are these high IQ neurodiverse brains different? Well, we can actually say something about how they are different. And probably one of the most compelling things is to look at this physical brain data in brain development over time. So check out this chart. This is looking at kids from ages 7 to 19. And it's charting the thickness of brain cortex. The outer layer of your brain is the cortex of your brain. It's the thinking layer. And actually, if you pulled it out of your head and stretched it out, it would be kind of like a pancake, and you can measure the thickness of it. And that's what they're doing here. It's smashed into your head, and that's where the folds come from. Yeah. Okay, so thankfully they can measure the thickness of brain cortex in kids non-invasively. That's key for a large N study with kids. They studied about 307 kids, I believe, over a period of 10 years. So this study took a while to do, which is why it hasn't been replicated yet, by the way. And they measured each kid at least twice, some of them more. Now, let's take a look at the blue line here, the average line. What they did with the data here is different than other similar studies where they sorted the data by IQ. Okay, now the average line for kids who had average IQ actually followed the pattern that we've seen in neuroscience for a long time, that the brain cortex thickens up in early childhood before age 7, peaks around age 8, and then there's this process of pruning that takes place. Well, let's take a look at our what they called superior IQ cohort. This was with IQ above 121. 121 is not a very high cutoff. Most folks who, sort of the typical gifted cutoff for IQ is 130. And so this is actually substantially below that, almost a standard deviation below that. But you can see that for that cohort of higher IQ, their developmental trajectory was totally different. The cortex didn't thicken up until much later. It peaked around age 12, and then the process of pruning took place. It's kind of a big deal. So we've got this early period where there's this continued brain expansion that's not happening in other individuals. And then we've got this pruning process that's happening afterwards. But the timing of that pruning is happening at a different time. Here's a different researcher, was not involved in this research at all. In fact, it happened quite a bit later. They were doing empirical research looking at behavior. And what they saw was that kids who had higher IQs to begin with seemed to have an extended period in adolescence during which they retained the ability to learn at a rapid pace, just like much younger children. Wow, isn't that crazy? They retain the ability to learn at a rapid pace, just like much younger children. It really aligns with this physical data. But let's look at one other thing to help make the most sense of this. That whole pruning process where the brain is maturing and consolidating, that pruning is really about, the stuff that you are using gets to stay, the stuff that you're not using gets pruned away, the cortex gets thinner, but it also gets more efficient, less noisy, less sort of random stuff going on, more directed. That whole pruning process or maturation process doesn't happen in your brain all at the same time. It actually starts in the back of your brain at the occipital lobe, that's vision, works its way to the front of your brain behind your forehead, which we call the prefrontal cortex. Well, the prefrontal cortex, that's kind of the seat of executive function. It's not the only place where executive function happens, but a lot of the sort of major brain areas that are involved in executive function live here. So on that whole pruning trajectory, as the brain is pruning from the back of the head to the front of the head, executive function is not first on the list in terms of brain maturation. So we can kind of apply that now to our chart, where as the brain is pruning, we've got this maturation that's happening, right? And executive function is not the first thing that's getting pruned. It's somewhere on the downhill side of that line. Well, now let's look at our red line kids. That process is also happening for them, and executive function is still not the first thing that's getting pruned and that's getting matured. It's somewhere on the downhill side. Let's make this really real. Look at the years. That's middle school, ages 11 to 13 or so. In our typically developing population on the blue line, they're actually quite well down their way of maturing their brain, and they're starting to develop executive function. And for most kids, that works. In middle school, they have to do, a lot more the transactions of school and be more responsible for their own stuff, see multiple classes and multiple teachers, take more individual responsibility for their homework, all that stuff that is often executive function tasks. Well, where are our kids on the red line in middle school? They're in a totally different place from a developmental standpoint. They may not have even turned the corner yet towards starting to prune and mature their executive function from a physical perspective. Not never, just not yet. And we actually see that in this population. If you have full-time classes of gifted kids in middle school, often those teachers are quite confused as to why kids in their classes are having so much trouble with things that kids in other classes don't seem to have trouble with. And it's one of the reasons why a school like Nova Middle School is so fabulous, who can really specialize on kids who have these very unique developmental needs that are different than other kids at this developmental stage. Here's somebody else who's commented on this. The maturation of the prefrontal cortex of gifted children is often delayed compared to other children, but then catches up unusually rapidly. Okay, so what do we do? Well, first we need to recognize that not everybody is on the same timeline, right? That's population data. And so there are going to be kids who will be ahead of the curve where executive function is not a big challenge for them. And there will be some kids who are going to be behind that curve, and they might really take quite a lot longer to catch up in executive function. It may really take until their 20s, and we see that in this population. But probably the biggest thing to recognize is that if it's a developmental problem, if the brain hardware is just not developmentally ready yet, tough love is not a strategy. Grades as a feedback loop is not a strategy to help a kid develop executive function. If the physical hardware is not there yet, it's not a realistic expectation. And so we need to be really careful that we're not expecting our kids to do something that they're not developmentally ready for yet. And of course, different kids are going to be on different timelines. But in general, for this population, that timeline tends to be a little bit delayed. How much delayed? On average, about 4 years. So if you are here with your teacher hat on, one really important question to ask yourself is when you are creating report card grades, especially in middle school, high school, secondary grades, are you measuring executive function? The ability for the kid to actually complete the transactions of school, to hand in homework on time, to remember to do the thing, to break down the large projects, etc. Or are you measuring their subject mastery? That is a really tricky conversation, but it's one that I think is really essential to think hard about our practice. The big message for most of our kids is that they just need lots more scaffolding and support for executive function, especially in middle school and early high school. For most kids, it tends to snap in around 10th grade. So it may really be a while. All the same strategies that you might use for ADHD to support a kid with ADHD are typically the same strategies that you would use here. And here's a quick list to give you some ideas of what that might look like. So 10 ways that you can support executive function. Number one, you make time visible. So whether that's schedules on the wall or calendars or timers, the time timer is what you see there on the right. It's a really great gizmo that makes time visible, available on Amazon and plenty of other places. You make cues and charts and checklists for everything so that kids don't have to hold that in their head, that it's actually in front of them, and that makes it easier to manage. Folders tend to work better for these kids rather than binders. If you're a teacher, I encourage you to keep a master binder of everything you've ever handed out so that when the kid inevitably loses it, there is a known good location where they can go get another copy. Make sure that you have extra pencils, markers, rulers, etc. available. Don't be sending kids to go run out to their locker all the time to go fetch that stuff. Provide support, whether that's at home or in the classroom, to help kids break down those big projects into manageable chunks. That is a pretty advanced skill. It's not going to be the first one to happen. They're going to need support with that for a long time. Graphic organizers, sticky notes, highlighters, all those kinds of tools tend to be helpful. Many of these kids are going to need a lot of reminders. We really benefit from flexible late or missing work policies, giving them lots of chances to do what they need to do. Provide class time to update the planner, to organize binders, to organize desks, depending on what grade level you're at. And certainly if a student has an IEP or a 504 plan, to follow that, because chances are somebody spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was going to work, and don't reinvent the wheel. All right, I want to give you a little bit more neuroscience about high IQ. One of the interesting things that has been debated is whether the high IQ brain is different. Well, we can say now with a lot of confidence that it is different. Is the high IQ brain bigger? A little bit, tiny bit. Not big enough, not a big enough difference to really matter, but a little bit bigger. The difference that is much more significant, however, is about regional brain volume. Some regions of the brain are much bigger. So wait, if some regions of the brain are much bigger and the total volume is really not that much different, that means that other regions have to be smaller, and they do see that. There's more dense connectivity between some areas and also sparser connectivity in other areas. We've already seen that development happens on a different timeline. We could have argued this 10 years ago. We can't really argue it anymore. High IQ brains are physically different in ways that we can measure. We don't understand what the implications are of all those differences, but they totally exist. And actually, this is fairly recent research. So here are the citations just for the stuff that I've been talking about on this slide. And you can see that a lot of them are quite recent, past 5 years. There's a lot of neuroscience happening in this area, a lot of really recent neuroscience that continues to be happening. If you're looking to find the articles here, there's a great organization in California called Grow Gifted that has been pulling together both the neuroscience as well as the physiological research on the gifted population. They have a really great repository, so feel free to take a look there if you want to dig in more detail. All right, so I have this kind of an analogy. The gifted brain is like a Ferrari. It's really shiny. It's really fast. It can do some things extremely well. However, a Ferrari does not do everything well. You would not take your Ferrari to the beach. You would not take your Ferrari camping. You would not take your Ferrari to pick up the grandparents to take them to the movies. The Ferrari is good at some things, and what it's good at, it is exceptionally good at, but it is not good at everything. And our Ferrari has a little problem on top of that. There's a very tiny steering wheel, not a lot of self-control. This is a really great analogy for the gifted brain. It is not better at everything. It's better at some things. Also not as good at some other things. Pros and cons. From a neuroscience perspective, there's a really fascinating common link that's starting to emerge out of research, which is this idea of inhibition. Inhibition is the neuroscience way of saying turning things off. When you're paying attention to something, it's not really that your brain is saying, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. What your brain's really doing underneath the covers is it's saying, ignore that, don't worry about that, don't worry about that, don't worry about that, so that all that's left is what you're paying attention to. That phenomenon is called inhibition. Your brain is inhibiting all those other things. It appears that the high IQ brain has a real tough time inhibiting things, turning things off. It's more likely to get overflowed and overflooded. That concept is going to come back again as we talk about emotions. So I promised that we would talk about executive function in a little bit more detail. Now that you've got some more texture for why it really matters in our population. Executive function is about organization kind of things and also about regulatory things. So things like organizing time, multitasking, keeping track of things, time management, breaking down projects into smaller pieces, but also kind of regulatory attention kind of things. Waiting to speak until it's your turn, self-control, having that mental flexibility to be able to see the shades of gray. Sometimes our kids are black and white thinkers, don't necessarily always see those shades of gray. And so all of these things are executive function things that are actually separate from IQ. And so expecting our high IQ kids to necessarily have these skills, that's not a connection that typically exists. In some kids occasionally, but not usually. Again, asynchrony. Could be high in academics, not so high in executive function. All right, let us jump into our next big topic and talk about emotions. So this is a place where I'd like a little bit of audience participation. I want you to think about the kid that brought you here today and just type it in the chat. What is a characteristic of your child? Could be positive, could be something more challenging. I don't really care what perspective you take. If you had to describe your kid in 1 or 2 words, what would you say? Talkative, curious, forgetful, intense. That inhibition bit, yeah, never stops blurting. Perplexing, perfectionistic, enthusiastic, anxious, empathetic, disorganized, butterfly, lovable, a lot, easily hurt, inflexible, curious, hard on themselves. Yeah, quite interesting. I'll let you guys keep talking there. I hope you're seeing that maybe some of the things that you might be struggling with are common in this population. And I also want to point out that all these characteristics that you're bringing up, they have both positive and negative aspects. Let's take one that I like to talk about, stubbornness. Anybody have a stubborn kid? That's fairly common in our population. What's the positive side of stubbornness? Oh yeah, being able to like really stick with a problem and to kind of want to get to the end, and yeah, persistence for sure, right? There's a real positive side to stubbornness, but there's also a really challenging side to stubbornness. And if we had more time, we could pick apart every single word that you guys added here and kind of look at it both on the yin and the yang of, what's the positive side of that? And then also what's the more challenging side of that? And I guess the big message that I'd like you to muse on is that it's actually the same characteristic. You don't get to pick whether you get the good side or the bad side. It's actually all the same thing. And so seeing the complexity of our kids like that can be really helpful to understand our kids more thoroughly. There are 3 common characteristics in this population. This comes from SANG, that national organization that I mentioned earlier. SANG stands for Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted. It's actually a fascinating organization. It's a national organization that does not want to talk about school, not even a little bit. And in fact, they're not only interested in kids, they're interested in babies all the way through elders throughout the lifespan. They want to talk specifically about emotions, social development, kind of the whole human, not just about the academics. That's how important this topic is for this population. They say that there are 3 common characteristics in our population: sensitivity, intensity, and perfectionism. I'm pretty sure all those came up in your chat. Let's talk about each of them one at a time. So perfectionism. Perhaps you've got a kid who erases a hole in the paper. That's a real common way that perfectionism can show up, but it's actually not the most common way. It's probably the most common stereotype. Can show up lots of other different ways. Like, how about a kid who's impatient with others because they're not doing it right? I know what right is and they're not doing it the right way. Or a kid who melts down at the first sign of trouble, or who can't make a decision, even vanilla versus chocolate, because they want it to be right. Who reach for impossible goals, who hate criticism, who dwell on mistakes, who have trouble accepting compliments. This one's subtle, guys. Why? Because in my heart of hearts, I know that it wasn't perfect. And so your compliment feels to me like a lie. For a lot of these kids, they're unwilling to start. They're afraid to try. I don't want to. Champion procrastinators. What's really going on underneath perfectionism? Is it really a drive to make things perfect? I would argue probably not. For most of our kids, perfectionism is really driven by a desire to avoid failure, to avoid risk, to avoid the possibility of a mistake. It's perhaps not the world's best word, actually. With this definition of perfectionism, how many of you folks here feel like you got a perfectionistic kid? Feel free to talk to each other in the chat. This is your community. All right, let's talk about sensitivity. For many of our kids, things are too loud or too scary, even movies, even Disney ones, even for 10-year-olds. Some of our kids are super empathetic and they, another kid gets hurt and they're the one that's crying. Sometimes that empathy goes social justice, and now we're talking about the tigers and homelessness and hurricanes and every other kind of world problem. For some of our kids, it's really tactile, and clothing can be a major issue. Do you have a kid who wears the same clothes every day, where you've actually bought the same clothes in 3 different colors because that's the only thing that the kid will wear, where you can't find socks that work, where the kid is constantly ripping off their clothes at home because nothing feels good? For many of our kids, they have a low pain tolerance, or perhaps they have trouble with bathing and swimming. Why? Because the sensory here is so strong. A drop of water and they feel like they're drowning. It's a sensory thing. Many picky eaters in our population, also food sensitivities and allergies are at a higher rate in our population. Big reactions, tough to discipline these kids. Often they can be sort of sensory polar. They're either very sensory seeking, or they really need their own space and they don't want to be touched. And they kind of need their own bubble. So sensitivity tends to be sort of a theme that runs through our population as well. Last one, intensity. Oh my gosh, have you ever seen such a beautiful puppy dog? Or a kid who's so focused on what they're doing that you're yelling their name, but they don't even twitch, or they're putting on a really good show. They might have obsessions. It might be the obsession du jour. It might be a long-running obsession. They might have trouble with transitions because they're so intensely focused on what they're doing, it's hard for them to switch. They might be really focused on fairness. That doesn't win them friends on the playground. There might be a sort of drive towards competitiveness, nightmares, fears, anxieties, sleep issues, big meltdowns, big mood swings, high highs, low lows, fast changes. A lot of our kids are described as intense. And so I suspect that you're probably looking at these lists and saying, gosh, that is fascinating that she can describe my kid. And I hope that you can't identify with every bullet point here, but there's probably a theme that you're seeing here and you're a little bit like, that's interesting. And actually, I want to stop there and point out, like, that's actually unusual. Like, we really wouldn't expect, based on a concept like intelligence, for that to align to personality characteristics. And yet we do kind of see that. We are not the first ones to run into that. That was first coined by a Polish social scientist way back in the 1960s, by some records even earlier than that. That translates perhaps a little more directly to super stimulant abilities, although that's in debate as well. They come in 5 different flavors. Psychomotor is everything having to do with movement. So kids who have this surplus of energy, who run everywhere, who fall off their chair in kindergarten, who talk a mile a minute. Very easily can be diagnosed as ADHD. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but very common in this population. Sensual overexcitability, everything having to do with the 5 senses. People who see fluorescent lights blinking, who can smell things that nobody else can smell, etc. Imaginational overexcitability. This one's quite subtle and really quite fascinating in that our kids can have this really amazing superpower and that they can imagine things so completely that it feels real. And that is an amazing superpower and it fuels their creativity. but it has a flip side, the yin and the yang. They can also imagine the horrible, and it feels real. And that can be a major source of fears and anxieties, and sleep issues. Intellectual overexcitability is something that we assume all these kids have, that drive to know, the why. This would be a good place to point out that not all kids have all the overexcitabilities. Some kids don't have any overexcitabilities. That's not so common, but it does happen. There seems to be a little bit of alignment between overexcitabilities and IQ. Higher IQ, you tend to see more, they tend to be more severe, but even that is a little debated in the research right now. Emotional overexcitability, everything having to do with the emotions, positive and negative. What Dabrowski found behaviorally back in the 1960s, we can now see on a functional MRI. On a functional MRI, what you see is that these kids experience a more intense reaction in their nervous system visible on an MRI. That reaction lasts a longer period than normal, and the stimulus may be very small or even imperceptible to a neurotypical brain, like the blinking fluorescent lights that most people can't see, but some of you probably can, and they bug you. This is physical, guys. This is the brain that they were given and the neuroscience, the neurophysiology that they were given, and it's not going to go away. They're not going to outgrow it, and you're not going to therapy it away for the most part. We really have to recognize this as our kids' physical reality. And by the way, some of us as adults probably recognize some of these things in ourselves. How do you deal with it yourself? You understand what your triggers are. You avoid your triggers. You understand when you're getting overstimulated, and you know how to back off and change your situation so that you don't get overstimulated. Those are all the same kinds of strategies that we need to help our kids develop, to understand what their triggers are, how to manage it, how to self-soothe, how to redirect, how to get themselves out of a situation that is going to be challenging for them, because it's not going to go away. This is the body that they were given. One way to think about overexcitabilities is that our kids get stimulated more easily, and they also get overstimulated more easily. So there's a more narrow operating range where they can be productive, and it's kind of in a different place than other kids. They're just built differently. The brain and the nervous system is different in our population. By the way, overexcitabilities are not an accident. They support higher intelligence. Our kids, some of the reason they can do the crazy things they can do is because they see more, hear more, notice the patterns, have the energy. But at the end of the day, the reason that they get overwhelmed, it comes back to inhibition, right? If they can't turn it all off, it's so much more easy for them to get overwhelmed. And this is just yet another flavor of neurodiversity. We can call it neurodiversity, we can call it overexcitabilities, we can call it ADHD in some situations, but at the end of the day, we're describing the same sort of class of phenomenon. So, one of the most important things to recognize as both a parent or a teacher when you've got these kind of kids in your circle is that sometimes, especially with our younger crowd, when it looks like misbehavior, it's actually overwhelm. And you might need to sit with that. Because sometimes we're trying to discipline what is actually not a discipline issue. Sometimes what we need to do is recognize that the kid is overstimulated and that we need to actually help them re-regulate and help them figure out how to prevent that from happening again. There are some other common traits I want to mention. Real common for these kids to develop some existential thoughts. We might call it angst in some situations, or even existential depression. Can even happen with 4-year-olds. Ever have a 4-year-old fascinated with death? Anybody here? Usually there's a couple in every crowd. That can be super scary when it happens, but it's actually not that uncommon in this population. Imposter syndrome, very common with our older kids, high schoolers, as well as adults. It's the idea that very, very successful people, but who deep down believe that they're really not as smart as everybody thinks that they are, and they're kind of faking it, and someday somebody's going to find them out. That if that's ringing any bells for you, for somebody in your house, or you personally, highly recommend doing some reading on a Google search on, and that will be a cathartic and helpful experience. Also worth pointing out that it appears that trauma is more likely in our population, that the combination of high sensitivity and sort of this intensity of personality tends to lower the threshold, appears to lower the threshold for trauma. And so things that we might not think are traumatic, our kids experience as traumatic sometimes. And so that's worth keeping in mind. All right, I want to give you a couple sort of realistic tips for how you can help coach intense emotions in your kid, because that's often one of the biggest issues that families are working with, both at home as well as in the classroom, actually. It's worth helping your kid think through a scale of 1 to 10 about how big of a problem is this really? Is this a baby problem or a giant problem? Sometimes a kid might make it, with Pokemon or with Magic the Gathering characters or whatever. But the reason that you might make that chart ahead of time and have that conversation ahead of time is so that after something interesting happens, long after something happens, after everybody's nice and calm, because we're never going to debrief an event while everybody is still emotionally dysregulated. We can go back to that chart and say, well, okay, that's interesting. It looks like you had kind of a level 8 reaction, but like, how big of a problem was it? Oh, it was like a level 3 problem. What would a level 3 reaction have looked like? This is not about changing the kids' emotional state. The emotions, they're not going to change. But they can change their behavioral response to those emotions. It's about using their logical thinking skills to help regulate their behavior. With repetition, it is helpful for a lot of our kids. Also, from a physiological standpoint, the high IQ brain really does use glucose faster. Food really matters. Probably most important thing here is that you do not ever feed your kid just carbohydrates. That is a big mistake. Crackers are not a snack. Pretzels are not a snack. Oh my gosh, popsicles are not a snack. Protein and fat at every snack, at every meal, you need to feed your brain to have long-term energy. Otherwise, the kid just falls off the cliff of blood sugar, and that's going to be a major behavior issue. All right, last thing I want to share here is a little piece of neuroscience that I picked up from Dr. Dan Peters at the Summit Center in California. For this, you need a body part. I'd like you to pull out your thumb. So this last joint on your thumb is the same size as a structure in your brain called the amygdala. Can you say amygdala? Come on, play along with me. Amygdala. Okay. So your amygdala is in charge of emotions in your brain. And in fact, your amygdala is kind of a big bully and it wants to take over. Your amygdala wants to be in charge. When your amygdala is in charge, you are not a very fun person to be around unless you are very joyful and then only briefly. The good news is that your amygdala is in the center of your brain and it has your big brain around it. Get out your big brain and cover up. When your big brain is around your amygdala, it can't take over. You're much more of a reasonable human to be around when your amygdala is not in charge. However, if you get hungry, angry, lonely, tired, what happens? Your big brain lets go and, oh, your amygdala is in charge again. This is a lovely little piece of neuroscience, very similar to the flip your lid that you might be familiar with if you have teenagers. It's actually the same neuroscience principle. But this is a lot easier for elementary kids to do physically. It gives you a non-judgmental language to talk about what's going on inside a kid when they're having these really big emotional reactions. This validates that they really are feeling emotions that strongly. That is real. That's not going to change. But that doesn't mean that they can't control it. So you can say things like, I'm talking to your amygdala right now. Can you please get a grip? Can you please cover up? Can you please find your big brain? Are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired? to help the kid recognize what they can control, and to also give you a non-judgmental language to use. There are also some really lovely books out there now. The one on the left I particularly recommend for elementary and even into middle school. It's called The Gifted Kids Workbook. It's the best $15 you'll ever spend on Amazon. It has fabulous kind of workbook-like exercises on the inside. Probably the one that I like the very best is talks about the difference between knowing and learning. Very, very helpful. All right, let us talk about social stuff. When gifted kids are asked what they most desire, the answer is often a friend. The children's experience of school is completely colored by the presence or the absence of friends. Truth? Yeah, big truth. I would offer these axioms for social development. Number one, you can't force two kids to be friends. You can't point at two random kids in a classroom and say, you're going to be best friends, go. That just doesn't work. There has to be sort of an authentic social connection underneath, something that they really connect on. That's sort of the important first precondition. Number two, social development requires practice. There's actually no curriculum out there that teaches you how to be a friend. That's something you have to do through trial and error and practice and time. And number three, nobody wants to be lonely. But what we often see in these kids is a social mismatch, and that mismatch happens very early on, even as early as preschool. One of the first things you see in a preschool gifted kid is that they have a more complex vocabulary. Well, how does that play out on the preschool playground? Your kid says something and the other kids just don't have the words yet. So they get the deer in the headlights, like, I don't know what you just said. Right? And this is preschool. There's no bullying. There's no teasing. But there is kind of this like, I don't understand you. And it's over in a flash, and then they go run off and do something else. But that moment of your kid not being understood happens over and over and over and over again. They're interested in more involved games and more rules and fairness way before their age mates, and that does not win them friends on the playground. They're interested in niche topics, like our friends who, love World War II aircraft in first and second grade. There might not be other first and second graders who are into World War II aircraft. They may ask unusual questions. They realize really early on, there is something up here. There is something different about me. But why? Now, humans are meaning-making machines. They come up with a reason why that makes sense to them. I know an 8-year-old who is absolutely and firmly convinced that he's from another planet and he's waiting for his people to pick him up. That's how he made sense of his world. It's kind of funny, but in a way, it's really not funny, right? That's how he understands his social world. How do your kids understand their social world? What is the sense that they're making out of it? What's the reason that they are understanding? Because they know they're different, even if we're not talking about it. They may gravitate towards older kids or adults. It's a closer mental age. It's not perfect, but it's closer in some ways. They may feel like they have to fake it to make a friend, or you may even ask them or encourage them to fake it to make a friend. That's actually a pretty advanced social skill. Many of our kids simply can't do that yet. They may feel lonely. They may have some social isolation, even if they appear to have playmates. If they are able to articulate this as a young elementary student, they'll probably say something pretty nebulous. Nobody understands me. Or it's about humor. They don't understand my jokes. They don't think I'm funny. Here's a piece of research from Maraka Gross. She's from Australia. She studied 700 kids, both typically developing as well as gifted, and she found that there was a 5-stage ladder of social maturity that was in common for all of them. Here are the stages. Stage 1, she called play partner. You want to play? I want to play. Great, let's play. Stage 2, she called people to chat to. We would probably say people to talk to. This was about interests. You're into Pokemon, I'm into Pokemon. Great, let's talk Pokemon. Stage 3 was about help and encouragement, typically one way. Typically, a friend is someone who helps you. Stage 4 is where it got bidirectional, much more intimate, characterized by things like this. A friend is someone who shares your hopes and dreams, who understands your deepest feelings, who feels the same as you about things that are important, etc. Stage 5, she called the sure shelter. We might call it the BFF, or the best friend. What she found was that a profoundly gifted 6 or 7-year-old may already be in stage 5, whereas a neurotypical kid wouldn't get here until early adolescence, 11, 12 at the earliest. In general, what she found was that the higher the IQ, the more mature a social relationship the child was seeking. That is, their concept of what it meant to be a friend was higher on the social maturity ladder. But I want to point out that stage 4 and stage 5 are really all about friends who are just like me, who see the way I see, who think the way I think. It's actually a really important stage for kids to develop social skills with other kids who are like them before they develop skills with kids who are different from them. So our kids have this asynchronous social development where they're trying to achieve these higher maturity level relationships, but they don't necessarily have the practical and pragmatic skills that go along with that. Also, there's a big difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it. So our kids who are a little more introverted sometimes rob themselves of opportunities for practice. You might have a kid who has great social skills and they can really flex to match the interests of others, but they're still not necessarily getting their needs met. Here's how it plays out over time. The biggest maturity gap actually is quite early on, between ages 4 and 9, but it's the most invisible. Why? Because at those ages, almost everything happening in kid culture is adult mediated. Adults are organizing playground games, and everybody's going to everybody else's birthday parties. And so for the most part, it kind of looks like the soup of childhood friendship is happening. And you often don't notice that a kid is not really connecting with other kids around them. That mismatch becomes much more visible in 4th or 5th grade, where kids start getting left out of parties, play dates, playground games. And the big question is why? Why is this so predictable, and what is so special about 4th and 5th grade? Well, in 4th and 5th grade, that's when our neurotypical kids just got to stage 4. What was stage 4 about? Oh yeah, kids who think the way I do, kids who are just like me. Kids start forming small groups of friends at that stage. What do we call them? Cliques, right? That's who they invite to their birthday party. They don't invite everybody, they invite their little group. Well, our kids can easily get left out socially, not because they did anything differently and not because anybody's trying to be exclusionary, simply because of the natural social development that happens to all humans, where you find your birds of a feather first and develop socially with them before you are ready for diversity. Everybody needs their clique, even gifted kids. And it's an expected stage of social development. Our kids need that too. Unfortunately, it's even worse than that, because our kids are also quite sensitive. And so they can hear an offhand comment from a peer and they can really take it internally, and it can cause real serious turmoil. They might have a very intense response to what they perceived was rejection. That might not have actually been rejection, but they felt it that way. If that's happening in your house or in your classroom, I'd encourage you to play detective, find the facts of the case, and help identify possible other explanations for why things played out the way they did. Often the Ferrari went a million miles down the road, down one idea, didn't see the other possibilities, didn't realize that there were other ways to interpret what just happened. Also, many of our kids could use some direct teaching between the idea of playful teasing versus hurtful teasing. Especially come middle school, teasing in our culture is actually kind of a thing. Teasing among friends, particularly among boys, but not uniquely to boys. That people will tease each other to actually bring the relationship closer. However, our kids, sometimes with the black and white thinking, will sometimes hear teasing and will assume that all teasing equals bullying and all bullying is bad. And they may not recognize the difference between playful teasing and hurtful teasing. So helping kids recognize what the difference is, how to hear it, how to understand it, how to give it, how to take it, can be really helpful explicit teaching to help them be successful as they get older. So here's kind of how it plays out. You know, a gifted kid enters preschool with completely age-appropriate social skills. No reason to think that this kid is going to be behind, no organic problem here. In school, they feel different from other kids. They're looking for that deeper level of friendship, but they're not quite finding it. They're not finding the other kids who are like them. After a few years, they start falling behind in skill development just because of lack of practice. Nothing more exciting than that. That lack of social skills makes it that much harder for them to flex to find common interests with age mates. They may lose confidence due to perceived rejection that may not have even been rejection, but they felt it that way. Eventually, the kid is really visibly struggling socially. But as a community, we strongly believe in diversity. And we really want our kids to be socially successful with all kinds of people in their community. What do you do? I would argue that when a kid is struggling, do you keep chucking them into the deep end of the pool and expect that they're eventually going to swim? Or do you put them in the shallow end with a float and a teacher? And when I put it that way, it often starts to come into better focus. But there's something funny about social stuff. See, if a kid was struggling with math, we would get them a tutor. We would provide help and support. We wouldn't just keep saying, try again, kid. But there's something about social stuff that has our instincts as parents and as teachers assume that the problem is that the kid's just not trying hard enough and that they just need to get out there and they just need to try one more time. And that somehow on the 99th try, it's going to be different than the 98th try. We really need to change the environment so that kids can get social skill development back on track. And that usually has two real key components. One is to make sure that they have authentic connections with peers. And it helps a ton if they have similarly asynchronous social development where they're trying to achieve this level of friendship with these skills, which is weird and unusual for most typically developing kids, but in our population is common. Usually by the time they're really at this stage, they need some coaching and support. This isn't going to sort of fix itself with time. We need to recognize that neurotypical kids don't have to bridge all these asynchronies to develop socially. All kids need their birds of a feather groups for social skills group in stages 4 and 5, around 4th and 5th grade. It's really unrealistic to expect a gifted kid to develop socially in an environment where they don't authentically connect with other kids around them, where there is not a small birds of a feather social group for them. It's one of the reasons why specialty schools like Nova are so valuable for kids, not just academically, but also socially, to give them that social environment that's going to allow them to develop socially the way that everybody else develops socially. Probably more than anything else, it's this social stuff that actually got me motivated to start doing talks like this. I've been doing them for more than a decade now, because it's really important for all of us to recognize that we can prevent a lot of social problems by just providing an environment where kids have authentic social connections from the beginning. And it seems so small, but it's actually a big thing. And it changes how we develop programs and how we group kids and how we think about gifted programming, because I would challenge you to say that actually the most important outcome of gifted programming is social development, not academic. Both are great, but the social is actually the hardest thing to be able to make up for on your own. because you really have to have those other kids. You can't just do it by yourself. So often our kids end up with a portfolio of friends. They find their clique somewhere, and they build those skills, and then they branch out, and they might have friends in lots of different circles, and each of those friends scratches different itches, you might say. If your kid's having trouble finding their clique at school, here are some other places you might look. In particular, after school clubs, as well as summer camps and enrichment programs, can be really, really helpful. Northwest Gifted Child Association has a great list of summer programs. Highly recommend you look into it if you're looking for what's out there. But as I mentioned, when we pull kids together in gifted programs, that can really help kids socially. Whenever we place gifted kids with other similarly asynchronous peers, where they're going to have some authentic connection and they're going to have some time together. Serving the whole child is way more than just about academics. We want to make sure that we're serving the whole child, and that includes social and emotional development too. Okay, it's crazy that we could be talking here for, I don't know, well more than an hour and change. And we're only just now talking about school at the very end of this talk. Let's talk about school just a little bit. So when we think about a good school fit, we want to think about level, pace, and peers. We want to understand that level is not just about acceleration, it's also about depth and complexity. Pace, our kids need many fewer repetitions to learn something. And so that's why just putting them in a higher grade level classroom, it's a good solution. It's not a perfect solution, because really they learn faster and they don't need as much repetition. But peers are important for a good school fit also, not just for social development, we've talked about that, but also for collaborative working groups. We want to make sure that our kids are not the de facto leader of every collaborative working group they've ever been a part of. Our kids need to learn how to be leaders, yes, sometimes, but they also need to learn when it's time for them to back off and let somebody else be the leader. They need to learn how to be a follower too, and that's not going to happen if they're the de facto leader all the time. So when school doesn't fit, they can easily be so hungry intellectually that they can be quite annoying in a classroom environment. They might have trouble socializing. They might actually dumb themselves down to fit in. This actually can happen as early as kindergarten. So why don't we put one gifted kid in every classroom? Doesn't that help everybody? Doesn't that create great role models? Actually, no. When other kids look at the natural abilities of gifted students, that's not encouraging for them. They look and they say, if that's what it means to be a fabulous third grader, I can't do that. No matter how hard I try, I can't do that. It's too far away. That's not encouraging, it's actually discouraging. They're not productive role models in a typical classroom. We also really don't want other students to think that being a great student means they ought to be able to achieve at a high level without any visible effort. And unfortunately, when left in a general education classroom that's too easy for them, that is exactly the role model that they see. And that's not the message that anybody really wants them to be receiving. Gifted programs help kids socially. We've already talked about that, but I want to add this caveat. As long as you place kids early, kind of before that 4th and 5th grade transition. If the placement is in middle school, as I'm sure Tiffany can attest to, sometimes these kids need some more social support to kind of make up for lost time. Gifted programs also help kids emotionally. It's quite common for these kids to cry in class. They're intense, they're sensitive. In a typical classroom, that can be very socially limiting, even with a teacher who is really trying hard to create an open and inclusive environment. However, in a gifted classroom, it happens all the time and it's no big deal. That on its own can be an enormous, enormous improvement for a kid's social climate. Also, when we group these kids together, it gives them an opportunity to see that there are other kids who are sensitive and intense and perfectionistic and who don't get pathologized for that or misunderstood or feel like the oddball all the time. It gives them a more supportive, accepting environment. They don't all have the same sensitivities, but they all understand what it means to be sensitive. And that can create a much more genuinely supportive environment. So won't kids get arrogant if we label them and put them in a special program? Well, actually, the surest way to create an arrogant kid is to have them be the smartest kid in every classroom they ever walk into. We actually want them to be challenged by others. That's how they're going to learn humility. That's how they're going to learn real self-confidence. They already know that they are different. They don't know why they're different, but they know. Us talking about it is not going to hurt them. Is it okay for school to be easy? A lot of our kids end up skating through regular classrooms, especially through elementary school, where they pick up new ideas effortlessly. But eventually they're going to hit something hard. It might be middle school, it might be high school, it might be foreign language, it might be math, it might be physics, it doesn't matter what the subject is. But eventually they're going to hit something that's hard. And they're not going to have any strategies, any coping skills, any experience. The kids' lived experience is that things have always been easy for me because I am so smart. Eventually they run into something that's not easy. What's the natural conclusion? Ooh, maybe I'm not smart anymore. Do you see how imposter syndrome could blossom here? Some kids will dig deep when this happens and figure it out, but not everybody. And it really can go bad. We really do see dropouts in the high school population that are incredibly brilliant kids. We see suicide in this population. Some would say it's more common, others say no, it's not more common, it's just the same common. There's a recent study I just saw that suggested that kids with autism, actually, gifted kids with autism are much more at risk. School shooters have this really unfortunate habit of being often very bright boys who are not very well socially connected to their community. If you go into prisons, you do not see unintelligent people. Actually, the incidence of learning disabilities in prisons appears to be quite high. By one study, 75% of inmates had dyslexia. Now, it doesn't have to go that bad. What's much more common is underachievement. And what we don't think about is that underachievement started way back in first, second, third grade, because that's when most kids are learning how to deal with something that's hard, how to ask questions, how to try again, how to not get it right the first time and persist. Subtraction was not easy for most kids. Learning how to read was not easy for most kids. Learning how to multiply, how to spell, how to write a paragraph. All those things required a lot more effort for most kids than they are for a lot of our kids. Our kids miss out on a lot of that opportunity to develop all these skills. They won't actually have achievement problems until middle or high school, but we set the stage quite early on. Also, if they have a twice exceptional disability, it may really be hidden until the material gets challenging. And let me tell you, you really want to figure those things out, not with a cranky adolescent. When kids start to underachieve, the natural response for self-preservation is actually to stop caring. They're like, I don't care about school anymore. This is stupid. This is boring. You'd rather be disengaged and do bad than risk trying and still do bad. Do you hear the perfectionism in there? So there are some folks who have written books on related topics. One perhaps you've seen is Angela Duckworth's work on grit. Duckworth did us a big favor, and what she found was that grit was way more important in terms of long-term success than IQ. And she measured something very important for us. She measured that grit was usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. That is, in plain English, the smartest kids had the least grit, which actually shouldn't surprise us much because we didn't give them a whole lot of opportunities to develop it. Carol Dweck, about 10 years before that, produced the work that came out with the effort effect, or the idea of growth mindset, that we need to praise kids for effort. There are some really important takeaways from Carol Dweck's work, to not praise kids for being smart. They can't change that. That's not something that we are proud of, and it's not really something we should call a tremendous amount of attention to. It's a fact. It's not something that we talk about over and over again. What we talk about is effort, not results, effort, which means that we praise the thing that they had to work hard on. Which means that sometimes you're praising the project that turned out a little funky because the kid really had to work hard on that. And you might not praise the A or the amazing project because you know that the kid really didn't have to work at it, and that came pretty easy. To really apply Carol Dweck's thinking, you have to kind of sit with this a little bit. If you need a poster to hang up in your classroom or perhaps in your hallway at home, I can recommend birdseed.com. He's got a great little set of these cute little weightlifting brains. We only get stronger when it gets difficult. Some great longitudinal research that I want to just point out very briefly here. There's 2 longitudinal studies out there. They're quite long, that have been looking at exceptionally gifted individuals, not even garden variety gifted, but really exceptionally gifted, both the Terman study as well as SMPY. They're not perfect studies. They're very much overrepresented with affluent white males, but in a way, it actually makes their results that much stronger. Yes, on average, both of them have found that high IQ individuals were more successful when you look at degrees or occupation, leadership positions, creativity, patents, all that kind of stuff that you can measure and count. However, the median tells a very different story. Here's one data point that I find to be very, very helpful to understand this. More than 60% of men and more than 80% of women in this exceptionally gifted individual group had a salary of less than $100,000 as 35-year-olds in 2004. A few individuals were exceptionally successful. They pulled the average way up. But most gifted individuals, even exceptionally gifted individuals, this particular study was looking at the top 0.01% of IQ. Most of them lead very typical adult lives. Not unsuccessful adult lives, just typical. We expect all these kids are going to end up being rock stars and do amazing things. Some of them will. But on average, most of them are going to be pretty normal, typical, ordinary adults, and that's just fine. And we need to make sure that we understand that that's what the trajectory looks like, and that we don't put expectations on these kids that's really not realistic. By the way, what these studies found, what predicted success, the most successful individuals had 2 common things. They had a lot of support, and they experienced some acceleration in their academics, often grade skipping. So our smart kids are really at a disadvantage. When they're not challenged in school, they don't have this experience with how effort leads to results. So they don't develop grit, perseverance, tolerance for failure, growth mindset, time management, study skills. Those skills arguably are more important than any single subject we teach at school. Algebra at the end of the day is negotiable. This stuff, not negotiable for being a successful adult citizen in the world. So we need to help our kids build up persistence and grit. We need to give them experiences with real challenge and help them understand grit and growth mindset in that context. There's lots of ways to do that. It doesn't have to happen at school. We need to give kids an opportunity to struggle and fail and to persevere through challenge. This is something they're going to learn through experience. I want to remind you that adults don't have to be great at everything. When you think about adult careers, they focus on your strengths. You do not have to be a Swiss Army knife. What you actually do as an adult is you find yourself a niche environment that supports what you're good at and that avoids the things that you're not so good at. Our kids do not need to be well-rounded. In fact, they're much more likely to have spiky strengths. And you know what's fabulous about that? Colleges are looking for spiky kids. Colleges are no longer looking for well-rounded kids. And that's really an important thing to keep in mind. So
I'm in a
here
meeting, but I will join you when it's done.
here are the best practices to think about for high cap students. We want to make sure that we're providing challenge. We want to individualize as much as possible because these kids are individuals and they're going to have individual strengths and interests and needs. We want to provide accommodations as universally as possible because many of our twice exceptional kids are never going to be diagnosed. We want to provide a lot of flexibility to let these kids show their thinking in lots of different ways. They're not just writing essays all the time. We want to make sure that we're grading by learning objectives, not by executive function. But overall, we want to be thinking about how are we making sure that every kid is getting a chance to develop a spiky strength, because that's really what's going to carry them forward for the long term. A few closing words on equity here. Equity does not mean we give everybody the same thing. That's actually equality. We're talking about equity. Equity recognizes that different kids are in different places, and so different kids need different things. Everybody needs to learn something at school every day. That's just good old Vygotsky, not too easy and not too hard. So we don't want to be giving kids more work. We want to be giving them different work. It's not about extra classwork. It's not about feeling punished, and it's not about piles of homework. We're not trying to create a pressure cooker. We just want to make sure there's enough challenge that the kid actually builds grit. Not more work, different work. This is the real equity problem. Gifted kids from poverty and from minority groups are 2.5 times less likely to be identified for gifted programs across the country, and that's true in Washington as well. When provisions are denied for the gifted on the basis that they are elitist, it is the poor who suffer the most. The rich have other options. It's a really important reminder that when public schools start thinking that gifted programs are optional, who they're really hurting is our low-income community. Dr. Donna Ford says we cannot close the achievement gap or address the overrepresentation in special education of our subgroups until we address their underrepresentation in highly capable programs. Dr. Joy Lawson Davis agrees. She says new efforts to bring equity to programs by dismantling them will hurt the very children they are intended to help the most. Gifted children of color and from poverty need gifted education services. High cap is not a prize, it's a whole child intervention. We really have a moral duty to identify every high cap student, and our most vulnerable populations need it the most. I really see this as a social justice issue. So I want to recognize that you may be feeling some really powerful emotions right now. You might be feeling some grief that your kid is not normal. Is a lot less normal than you realized perhaps before you listened to this talk. You may also be feeling some guilt that you woulda, coulda, shoulda done something differently in the past had you had this information sooner. And I want to recognize that that's very real and not uncommon. And I want to urge you to get to gratitude just as quickly as you can. That you came today, that you listened to a very long talk on a weeknight. And that you can move forward now that you have this knowledge and hopefully share it with others in your circle who need it too. I want to remind you that we were talking about our kids, but we were also talking about you and your spouse and probably a big portion of your extended family. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Remember that these kids, they need downtime. Do not overschedule them. Do not push. Follow their lead. Don't try to therapy everything away. Some of it cannot be therapied away. And recognize that all these kids are going to be STEM kids, and that's okay. We need brilliant and amazing and thoughtful humanitarians and writers and artists just as much as we need scientists and mathematicians. Some of you may be asking, should I get my kid tested? The answer is probably no. Unless there's a problem, unless you have questions, unless you're confused. If everything's going well, then there's no need. But usually the biggest reason you would test your kid is because you have the sense that they might be twice exceptional. And you want to try to figure that out. That's usually the place to start. You might also want to talk to your kid. You might also want to share some of these slides with them. You might want to talk to them about being gifted, and here are some words you might use. So the bottom line is that these smart kids do not have it easy, not emotionally, not socially, not academically, not for grit or executive function. And it's not that they're broken, it's that we put them in environments that are mismatched to their needs. The more that we can put them in environments that actually fit their needs, like Austina Nova Middle School, the better that outcomes are going to be. So why do we serve these kids? Because they are a special needs population. Because if we don't do something different, they might actually not turn out okay. The goal is not eminent leaders or child prodigies or any of that nonsense. The goal is very simple: functioning citizens in our community who can hold down a job, who can communicate socially with the larger community, who have a positive self-concept, who can deal with challenges, and who can, do something productive with their lives. We're not expecting miracles. We're just expecting functional citizens. But if we don't do something different, they actually don't develop those skills. Because it was too easy. Everything was too easy, and they don't develop those skills. Why do we do the advanced math? It's actually not about the math. It's because math is one of the easiest ways for us to get a kid out of their comfort zone so that they can practice the bigger skills. If they end up going into STEM, the math will be super helpful. But if they don't, the skills that really mattered were the persistence, the perseverance, the tolerance for failure, the ability to recover from that stuff. That's the important part. It was never about the math. All right, there are some associations out there in our state as well as nationally. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take a few questions. It looks like we've got about 10 minutes left.
Thanks so much, Austina. That was fabulous. I know we're getting lots of really positive comments as well about how insightful this has been and what a relief for many people as well. We had a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to bring up. So the first one is wondering whether earlier in the very beginning of the talk, you talked about the Washington state law about gifted education and testing, and wondering if if that same law applies in Oregon.
No, Oregon is totally different. However, Oregon is also they are working on improving their laws. I think they're starting from 10 years ago. From Washington standards. But there is an Oregon State Association, OATAG, oatag.org probably. And so go talk to my colleagues down there. You'll end up talking to Margaret DeLacy and team, and they can tell you exactly what the scoop is locally. And you can probably get involved, because that's how things change, is by volunteers getting involved to advocate for things.
Awesome. So you also mentioned a little bit in your talk about the kind of existential angst that kids face often. And the question came up with, is this akin to fretting about all of the kinds of natural disasters, climate change, et cetera, for a kindergarten age student?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be so tricky, especially with a young kid like that, right? Who has sort of this cognitive ability to understand that this is a big, important problem, but has like no world experience to be able to put it into context. And so that asynchrony is a lot of what you're dealing with. Generally speaking, when kids are having big feelings about stuff, the thing that does not work with our population is to tell them, don't worry about it, everything's going to be fine, the adults have it under control. Doesn't work. It doesn't work, don't try, right? You really have to help the kid process through and understand. And often if you can find something that the kid can do to help, even if you from an adult perspective know that it's a drop in the bucket, it often helps the kid feel like they can let it go.
Next question is, why are some states removing gifted programs in the name of equity?
If only I knew, and if only I could talk to all of them, maybe they would change their minds. The big problem is that identification is a really legitimate issue, and identification strategies, both in Washington state as well as elsewhere, have really been biased. I mean, that's a fact. And that is the thing that needs to be fixed, and that is the topic of my dissertation. And so until that can be fixed, sort of definitively, and I'm pretty sure that I know how to make that, 80% better. I think it's going to be a real tough conversation, right? Because people don't want to have programs that are clearly visibly inequitable, right? And that's the reality that exists in a lot of places. The problem is that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater at the same time, right? There really are legitimate reasons why we have these programs. They are super important and life-changing for the kids who are in them. And bad things happen when these kids don't have support. Excuse me. And it's also, it's really hard when you have a kid who really needs support and the teacher doesn't understand what to do. Like, teachers they're not evil, right? Like, this is almost always an issue of unawareness. I mean, I give this talk or something very like it as professional development on a regular basis, and I've never had a group of teachers argue. You think they might, but they don't. Because as soon as they hear the information, they're like, oh, how come we've never heard this before? Why was this not in part of my teacher prep program? Right? And then they get guilty. Like, oh my God, I had this kid 3 years ago and I didn't understand and I did the wrong thing, and how, right? It's a lack of information. It's a lack of information, but it's really unrealistic to expect a teacher to be able to differentiate to the degree that our kids need in the context of all the other crazy things that they have to do in a real classroom in our public schools. We don't have infinite staffing. We don't have infinite time. And there's only 24 hours in the day. And at the end of the day, it just doesn't really happen unless we do something different.
Great. There's lots more questions, but I'm just going to pick a couple more because I know we're almost out of time. But next one is, how often do gifted kids find playmates below their age? Maybe they're safer or easier to talk to at their emotional level.
Yeah, sure. That happens. That certainly happens. Is it productive? Yeah, probably a little bit. But often it's sort of because it's really not working with my age mates. It's sort of a next best plan, right? And so I would see that as a little bit of a warning flag, like something is not going well socially with this kid and we need to help them find the kids that they're going to really connect with. They need to have that authentic connection.
Great. Another question is, and you've spoken about this a little bit, and we will certainly share the slide deck is available there at the bottom of Austina's last slide. And we have recorded this and we'll be sharing the recording afterwards if you want to go back and rewatch or watch some of the things. But one of the questions is, are there any resources for HiCap by district in Washington?
Actually, for almost every school district publishes their HiCap information. So if you do a Google search for school district name highly capable, you'll probably get right to it. But there's also a pretty nice page on Northwest Gifted Child Association called Schools that gives sort of an overview of what the school situation is and has a nice short list of the school districts that offer full-time classrooms for elementary gifted programs, which is usually not always, but usually the better model.
And do you have private schools on that list as well?
There are private schools on that list. Yeah. So the handful of private schools that exist in Washington state that focus on gifted students are on that list as well, which includes Nova.
Awesome. Just a couple more because we're almost out of time, but do you think there's an issue with school districts over qualifying kids?
I am so glad you asked that question because I really think that is the wrong question to ask. But it is, in fact, the question that's being asked a lot right now. There is a really, really important piece of research out there. If you go search, the authors are Jonathan Plucker, Scott Peters, and a couple others. And the title is quite provocative. It's something about should all students take a gap year? What they did was they looked at They looked at state data from 3 different states for every single student in the state, looking at smarter balance scores and looking at how many kids were actually scoring above grade level. And what they found was, in these large states, looking at all the kids, enormous percentages of kids were scoring above grade level. Like 15 to 50% of kids scoring above grade level, both in math and reading. Way more kids than we imagine are ready for above grade level instruction. The fact that we think that there is only 2 to 5% of these kids in our population is just dead wrong. There are way more kids who are ready and are already performing at that level. And that's without really a whole lot of support. Imagine if we give them some support, how far they could possibly go. Not that acceleration is the be all and end all, but it's a really great benchmark to be able to see, yeah, there's a lot more kids out there who are ready for something that is more accelerated and enhanced instruction. Yeah.
Great. We just have, I'm just going to do one more question. And if you did not get your question answered, you know that Austina's email is right here, and her website. I know we had a question about when's your next talk, Austina. So you can go to the smartisnoteasy.com and find out more from Austina as well. But this one I think is a great way to end. Are there common ways and solutions when multiple gifted members of the family clash, especially when their overexcitabilities are in conflict, or one family member getting flooded or taxed by the demands or perfectionism of another?
Yeah, I mean, so that's real. Like, living in intense households with intense, sensitive, perfectionistic, neurodiverse humans is not going to be easy, and there's no magic solution there, right? But one thing that helps a ton is for everybody in the household to have a language and to understand these foundational things so that they can name it and they can see and start mapping sort of what their triggers, if you will, are, and what things really bother them, and so that everybody can communicate so much better on what's actually really happening. Just understanding it takes a lot of the air out of the balloon. It's when it's, you know, we are constantly grading on each other and we can't even understand why, that's when it becomes untenable. And so highly encourage you to share this talk, share the recording, share the slides. You know, that's a real great start. Yeah. And in terms of the next time I'm giving this talk, I do not have anything else on the calendar this year, but I give talks when people invite me to come give talks. So invite me to come give a talk somewhere, I'll give a talk somewhere. And so please reach out if that is of interest for you in your community, whether that's a school or a PTA or whatever.
That's great. Thank you very much, Austina, for being here. Thank you to all of our participants for also sticking with us for a couple of hours. I know this was a lot of information, but so many amazing tips and thoughts to think about. So we really appreciate you coming. You can always look up Nova Middle School if you're in the Olympia School District as well. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you, Austina, and everyone have a wonderful night. Take care.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. Good night.
Thank you.